Hello, everybody. I'm talking today to Professor Glenn Diesen of Norway, and Glenn Diesen has caught my attention through his brilliant analysis of the current situation of the global geopolitical situation, which, with most of which I happen to agree, which makes it an additional plus. But anyway, it's a non-conventional view, but a very well-founded and recent view, and I've seen him with my dear colleague John Mearsheimer and others, and so I'm very, very glad, Glenn, that you are joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Um, Glenn, you have a quite, let's say, contrarian view to the general picture in the mainstream right now about geopolitics, and it's very critical of what NATO is doing, what the West is doing. And you are still a professor. I used to be a professor. I quit university service, my tenured position 7 years ago, and I'm quite happy for it. So, how is it when you are outspoken about your views? How is the treatment at home?
Well, it's very unpleasant. Well,
Okay.
I think it's similar to as they would have in Germany. That is, they come up with terms like Putin versteher. So essentially, the argument is if you try to understand the opponent, then then you're legitimizing them and you're taking their side. I think it goes into this idea that words aren't supposed to describe objective reality, but it creates your own social reality. But the consequence of this, my great concern is that the adversaries of the West, which do not have to be adversaries, but nonetheless, Russia, China, Iran, others, it's not that they're just adversaries, but we don't actually discuss their security concerns. It's seen as being controversial. You might be legitimizing them by suggesting that they have security concerns. This creates a very difficult situation where any efforts to explain how to avoid conflict or end conflicts become then, you can only point to the opponent. This is something I discovered when I did my PhD, actually. I did it on the security dilemma, assuming that both sides are challenging each other's security. And when you, for example, say how Russia undermines our security, it's like, yes, of course. But then if you want to discuss how we undermine the Russian security, then suddenly it's something controversial. And I just
Yes.
think it's very problematic that we end up in this situation because you say
Yes.
contrarian, but the
Yes.
mainstream view is not based on evidence. Russia was
Yes.
supposed to run out of weapons in March of 2022. NATO would be stronger than ever. Ukraine would be a thriving democracy. Ukraine was winning. The people who said this all along, they're the ones who are the mainstream. All the people who got it right, they're pushed out.
Yes. And of course, you and I know, and our listeners know, most of them, that's a propaganda war and a war of narratives, and that, let's say, sober analysis is taking a back seat, is maybe pushed out completely. So I'm very grateful that you hold this up, and I applaud you for standing firm in your university. I know the university environment, and I know that in the US, of course, the Ivy Leagues in many ways are the spearheads of ideological contamination, if I should say, if I could call it that way. So thank you for it, and let's go into the topics. We have a lot of stuff to discuss. We won't make it too long. The world is turning upside down, and we've just had a number of developments in the past weeks, I would say. Iran, Greenland, Venezuela. So lots of things are happening, but I will come to that at the end. You are in Norway. Norway has been a NATO member for a while, but there's been big changes happening in Norway recently, and probably people in Germany and in the world are not aware that Norway has, let's say, taking a more aggressive stance or a more whatever you may call it. So could you explain that?
Well, you can put this to all of Scandinavia. It used to be considered a region of peace throughout the Cold War, but that's not because we are inherently more peaceful than the rest of the world. It's
You were the Vikings, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not in our DNA. I think it's the geopolitical situation that is. Norway had a policy of during the Cold War of not having any foreign bases on its soil. We were one of the original members of NATO, but we were NATO light. We made clear to the Soviet Union we did not host foreign troops on our soil. We would limit activities up in the Arctic, which is the main front line.
Hmm.
And for this reason, we recognize the security competition. We wanted to deter the Soviet Union, but without provoking. And this is the main challenge in international security, where we compete for security. How do you deter the opponent without provoking them? This we do not do anymore. And then, of course, Finland, Sweden.
Let's stay with Norway for a second.
Yeah,
I read in one of your tweets that now Norway has, I mean, our listeners probably don't know the situation, so it's probably good to explain it a bit or to just to talk about it. I saw in one of your tweets that Norway has now basically granted the US 30 plus extraterritorial bases. I mean, this is a major shift. How can this thing happen and why did it happen?
well, we don't have we don't allow foreign bases on our soil, so we don't call them bases. We have a different word for it, but it's bases. It's kind of what you do when you can't argue for something, you just manipulate the language. But yes, we're opening American bases access across the country, and especially in the Arctic, where the Americans have made it clear they want to confront the Russians, which is part of the reason why they want Greenland, by the way. And this goes contrary to what we had in the past, and but it also goes with issues such as the Ukraine war. I mean, Norway was just like the other Europeans used to say that diplomacy was the most important thing. If there's a shooting war, the first thing you do is talk. Now we don't have diplomacy with the Russians. None of our elected leaders think we should. And also, Norway had a policy all the way up to 2022 that we never sent weapons to countries at war. Even our
Yeah,
prime minister
Germany
said that.
too.
Sorry?
It's in the German Grundgesetz, I would say. I mean, something like this. No weapons to crisis areas.
Yeah, well, even our prime minister said after Russia invaded Ukraine, it's out of the question for us to do it
We
now.
had the same discussion in Germany,
Yeah,
and it escalated, of course.
but 4 years later, every single member of parliament is for sending weapons, and no one's calling for diplomacy. Every single one. So
Is
it's a
there
bit
no
like
zero opposition in parliament? I mean,
no,
not
there's
even
nothing.
one.
I, I,
That's
I,
amazing.
I tried to run for parliament last year. One of the political parties put me up as a candidate, a new party, and essentially I said we need to have diplomacy, not sending weapons. And the previous defense minister and foreign minister, she said, well, I was more or less spreading Russian propaganda because if I really cared about Ukraine, I wouldn't want diplomacy. I would just want to send weapons, you know. But you see the consequence. The country is
Mhm.
being destroyed, and we're moving towards nuclear war. But it's not that, you know, they would have different opinion. It's that there's no other acceptable position to have. Either you follow the government or you're more or less a traitor. And this is why it's so difficult to have any
Well,
discussion here.
is, I mean, in some ways, Germany and also the Nordic countries are consensus societies. If you look at the
Yeah.
difference, let's say, to the Anglo-Saxon countries and so on and so forth. So I'm quite amazed. This is new to me that there's not a singular opposition to this in the parliament. So this shows at one level that the consensus society is working pretty well, but unfortunately for the wrong means. In Germany, at least, we have two parties that are against weapons. I mean, of course, they are being denounced and stuff, and they're not in government and they don't have enough votes, but at least we have some opposition to it. But Norway zero is quite shocking.
Yeah, no, it's just that it's unacceptable because we often see this within political propaganda. You come up with a position which everyone agrees with. For example, we have to help Ukraine because the country has been invaded. I'm all for helping Ukraine. I find what's happening there to be absolutely gruesome. But then you have this concept, everyone wants to help a country which is suffering under war. Yes, okay, so you have this concept, but then you fill it in with whatever you want. So how do you help the country? Oh, well,
Yes.
let's first, in 2014, let's topple the government without the public consent. Let's try to pull it into NATO, even though we know this would trigger a war. You know, let's put CIA bases along the Russian border. I mean, this is just complete madness. And now, even when you see, it's impossible to deny that the Ukrainians are losing. And towards the end of the war, you will see the casualties spike dramatically. You will see the civilian population suffer more. You will see loss of mass amount of territory. Even now, when we know they can't win, what is being supportive of Ukraine? It means pouring more weapons in, telling Zelensky not to let Ukrainians flee the country, look the other way as they have this brutal recruitment means. look the other way when they have all these extremist battalions, and you just stand by and wave a Ukrainian flag as the country burns to the ground. It's very crazy, but this is what we call pro-Ukrainian. While the people who
Yes, it
say,
is.
actually, we do have to take into account the Russian security concern. If you threaten Russia, what they consider to be an existential threat, the frontline state, Ukraine, will be destroyed. This is not legitimizing anything. This is recognizing reality. It's as if the Chinese or Russians would establish military bases in Mexico. That's not pro-Mexican. That country would be burnt to the ground. It's just common sense, but we kind
Yes,
of ban
which
that.
which it which it is. Yes. So that's Norway. And then of course we had Sweden and Finland joining NATO at the beginning of the war. I wonder. I mean, the Nordic countries had this long tradition of really neutrality or peacefulness, peace mediation, all these things. How and when did this start? And that the countries were, let's say, put on the wrong track, and then it went very quickly when the war started. I mean, what are your explanations for this?
Well, I think many people were shocked. They were surprised. They suddenly didn't know what Russia was doing. They feared it. And then, of course, if you listen to any politician or open any media outlet, you find out why. It's because Putin is Hitler, and Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union. After done with Ukraine, they will come for Sweden or Finland. This is kind of the rhetoric. So the problem in both Sweden and Finland was, while their military establishment wanted to join NATO, the public never went on board in terms of having a majority support. After Russia invaded Ukraine and the fear set in, then of course the polling went up. So then they showed, oh, now a majority wants to join NATO. Okay, let's do it right away, quick, before it will drop again, because you
But
can
you say that almost like a mechanical reaction, but isn't it that, let's say, certain leaders like the Finnish party's president, I mean the young woman, I forgot her name and so on, that they were kind of socialized in that mindset and they were in circles and let's say World Economic Forum or whatever you have, so that it had a long, let's say, prehistory like the Ukraine war had a long prehistory. I mean, there must have been preparations and attempts to do this for a long time, and this just was a catalyst, right?
Oh yeah, very much so. So it's been the objective, especially by the United States and British, ever since the Cold War, to kind of elevate the Soviet threat or then the Russian threat in order to try to pull them into NATO. And I did an interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, which is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, and he was making the point that when he was in the White House. Under the Bush administration, they would have these big whiteboards in the White House where they would list all the different European leaders and their position, who do what America wants and who oppose it. And then you can use journalists, NGOs, think tanks, political connections to push some down and other ones up. So, for example, he made the point early on. They recognized that Jens Stoltenberg, so who became then the prime minister in Norway, that he did everything he was told. He was a good boy. So, of
Yes.
course, so he's elevated. You put him in nice positions like NATO General Secretary, sorry, General Secretary General, and then others who are more critical of America's wars, for example, or expanding NATO, which is just a crazy policy, especially to Ukraine. Well, they are pushed down. They're not invited to the World Economic Forum. They're not invited to these different seminars, or they're not brought into the club essentially. So you cultivate the right political um, parties you want in Europe, and you run it a little bit like indirectly like a colony.
Yes, indirect empire. I mean, if you talk about empires, there's direct empires and indirect empires. So the Nordic countries, I mean, we now have this very dangerous and I'd say unfaithful shift towards a more confrontational policy. Um, and the countries together have like 27, 28 million people on an area of 1.3 million square kilometers. Germany has three times as many people on a third of the area. So, I mean, it's a huge, huge space with few people. What makes it so important? You said the Arctic will become, or the US views it as a new area of confrontation. So, what makes all of this so important?
Well, it's Scandinavia, first of all, as a region of peace. This is over, it's finished. And the reason is if you want to look at the main security concerns of Russia, something we shouldn't do, of course, anymore, it's ever since Kiev and Rus disintegrated in the 13th century, Russia lost a lot of their access to reliable access to maritime corridors. And if you want to look today, ever since, well, over the past 200 years, whenever the British or the Americans wanted to contain Russia, sorry, over the past 300 years, since Peter the Great, it's always been to disconnect it from the sea. So it's either the three seas on the western border. It's the Arctic, it's the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea. Now, obviously, the war in Ukraine, the efforts to expel the Russians from the Black Sea fleet, it was to make the Black Sea into a NATO lake. Then this is again what helped to trigger the war in Ukraine. Now, what's interesting with Scandinavia is once you get Finland and Sweden in, you and militarize Norway as well, you can now not just put a blockade on the Russians in the Arctic, which is part of the reason why the Americans want Greenland, but it also is the Baltic Sea. I mean, you had the former Danish Secretary General of NATO who made the point that now that Finland and Sweden are in NATO, we can put a blockade on Finland, no, sorry, on St. Petersburg if we want. You had an American general who said, "Oh, we could actually invade Kaliningrad." You have you have a different NATO officers and also political leaders in the Baltic states and Poland saying, "Oh, the Baltic Sea should be a NATO lake. We should be able to intercept Russian ships. Kaliningrad should be very worried by now." I mean, this is what we're talking about. So
It's mind blowing it's mind blowing how those perspectives and the narratives and the plans have shifted. I mean, it's just really mind blowing.
But it's how you think about security as well. This is hegemonic assumption that the more leverage we have against the Russians, the more secure we'll be. Look how many guns we now have in the Baltic Sea pointing there. Look how we can contain the Russians. Well, that assumes that now we have more security. However, this is premised on the idea that if we have enough guns pointing at Russia, somehow they will just capitulate and accept, okay, we will do as we're told. But this is not going to happen. The Russians will strike back very fiercely if necessary. They're not going to capitulate. I think people should really open some history books about the Russians and see whether or not they will capitulate. But with especially Sweden, I mean, it used to actually be a great power, but then all until the Great Northern War, which ended in 1721, in which Peter the Great defeated Sweden. And this is when Russia became a great power. Before then, Russia had a restricted access to the Baltic Sea. Thereafter, Russia became essentially an empire, became a maritime power. It considered itself then to be a real European power. Now, what we're talking about here with militarizing Scandinavia is reversing this to some extent, cutting off Russia from the Arctic, the western point, and also cutting it off from the Baltic Sea. This is the idea that Russia will just give up Kaliningrad, or as the American general said, hey, let's, we could invade it quickly. Russia couldn't do anything. But then what? What happens the next day when we have 1 million Russians living under NATO occupation? What will the world's largest nuclear power do then with hypersonic missiles, which are being pumped out now? It's just, this is absurd. The idea that somehow they would just capitulate and do as they're told.
That's hubris of empire, maybe what one could call it. So, but I mean, now have an interesting development. We have Denmark, who is a very avid NATO member and who was the first to recognized Kosovo in the 90s, so was very much pro-NATO, and now Trump is saying he wants Greenland. So is that going to change anything? Is the US going to prevail? What's the scenarios here?
Well, I don't think that military option would be their first one. I think that the best approach for the Americans would be to first threaten military force, and then the Danes know that they couldn't hold on to it if they fought the Americans. And if the Americans are forced to take it by military force, then they will NATO will be finished, and the Danes will be essentially an enemy of America, and they will be humiliated. So I think what the Americans likely do is threaten military force, but then at the same time say, listen, NATO is a great institution, so we can keep it, and we're going to give you money for Greenland, but we have to have it. So essentially, the Danes should take that offer.
Blackmail.
Which is good for America too, because it would be very unpopular for them to use military force against Denmark. And also, when the new government comes in after Trump, they might actually hand back the occupied territory to patch things up with the Europeans. So it would be more permanent if you actually had that if the Danes take that check. Alternatively, you can do it step by step because Greenland, you can sever it from Denmark first. You can stage some Maidan, some democratic revolution. So Greenland secedes, and once the secession is completed, it will be much easier for the Americans to absorb it. But there's some different pathways, but the Americans seem rather determined that they should
That's
go
what
for
I'm saying.
this. Of course, they
That's
could just go
what
for
I'm
the
saying.
military option as well. It is
Mhm.
possible. But I think Trump is the president of low-hanging fruit. He would like something easy, painless, and get it done with quickly so he can move on to the next thing.
Yes, Trump seems to be very determined. So what's your prediction? Or what are the probabilities or chances that the US is going to get away with this and will be intact? I mean, I would think, as you said, that this is the most likely scenario, that there will be some kind of pressure and stuff, and then there will be a negotiated deal under pressure. So, but what's the probability?
It's hard to say. I think it's the problem for the Europeans is they want to keep America and Europe at all cost. Ironically, if they get Greenland, they don't need Europe that much because then they have the territory for themselves. So, I think because of this, the Europeans are so fearful of alienating the United States. I mean, they could blow up our energy infrastructure with Nord Stream, and we still stand by them, nodding that yes, it was probably the Russians. You know, this is how we behave. So I think we kind of weakened ourselves to a large extent, and they know this. So I think there's two problems now that makes Europe excessively dependent on the United States. First is security, because we chose to make an enemy out of Russia, and we have this war in Ukraine. We're completely dependent on the United States for security, which means we can't afford to have them leave Europe. The second is the economic dependence. The Americans saw the world becoming more multipolar, and they essentially told the Europeans, you should not diversify like the rest of the world does. You should just cut your ties with key centers of power and only develop dependence on the United States, which we did. We cut ourselves off the Russians. We're increasingly cutting ourselves off China, Iran. We're even being told we should put sanctions and tariffs on the Indians. So at the end of the day, we put all our eggs in the American basket. And once this happened now, the Americans can demand anything. They can have von der Leyen show up at his golf course in Scotland and sign under any horrible deal he proposes. But this is the new reality. It's because we made ourselves excessively dependent on the United States politically, economically, and in terms of security. And for this reason, I don't think we have much to stand up. If America wants Greenland, it can take it. I think the best thing Europe can do is suggest that it would be a high cost and it would be prolonged. Like yes, something that would pull in the whole continent. I mean, this is often what you do when you have tripwires. For example, in Western Berlin, during the Cold War, if you have a few thousand troops there, the job of those American troops is to die essentially. Once, if the Soviets would have come, they die. Now it becomes impossible for the US not to get involved. Same as South Korea. All the American troops can be eliminated by North Korean artillery. They're a tripwire. If the North Koreans attack, they wipe out all the American troops. It's a guarantee that they're committed. I think the Europeans should do the same in Greenland. Put troops there. If the Americans want to take Greenland, they have to wipe out all these European troops, and then there will be a permanent conflict between Europe and the United States. It's a big gamble, but if there's no high cost, the Americans will just take it. And I
That's
think that's most likely.
That's an interesting suggestion because it's basically turning the tactics around. I can see that, but I'm not sure somebody will do that.
No, I
Um,
don't think so either.
Economics is my field more, and I see with great dismay that really how the German economy is being dismantled. I mean, it started really after 1945, but it held up pretty well until the 90s, even the early 2000s. I could go into that. It's a long process, but so it has gone very far. I'm not so sure with the concern with the security. I mean, of course, German, French forces are not that significant, but they are there. And who would be attacking us if there was no NATO, if there were no Americans? I mean, where would be the problem, really?
No, I don't think there would be. This is why I'm always perplexed when you have all these foreign ministers and generals saying, "Oh, Russia could invade, you know, we have to prepare for war. Exactly why would they invade? They don't answer that part. Who in the right mind in Moscow wants to rule over Poland or Germany, where 0% of the population wants to be ruled? This is that era is gone. It's the main reason why the Russians would strike, for example, Germany, would be if, for example, the Taurus missiles are being used to attack Russia. Then I think it's probable that Russia could strike some logistics centers, military
Yes.
facilities, production centers, something that allows Germany to attack Russia indirectly or directly. But this is the point. From the Russian perspective, this would be then a retaliation. The idea, but otherwise, why would we? And
Even Western, yeah, even Western Ukraine is illogical. I mean,
it doesn't. No, the Russians don't want to go there. Even if you offered it to them, they wouldn't want it. Why would you want millions of people who hate you under under living within your borders? It doesn't make any sense at all. And it would be so ugly that even their closest allies would turn their backs on them. So no, it's not going to happen. But this is the kind of narratives we end up with when we have to say again at the beginning that this was unprovoked. I mean, we had, especially in the United States, all this high level, you had intelligence chiefs, ambassadors, foreign ministers, all of them saying the same thing, that not all saying the same thing, but many saying that NATO expansion would be a threat to Russia. We would alienate them. Russia would at some point retaliate. And this was predictable. This is why it's very frustrating. If you can't discuss NATO expansion, you can't make any sense of the Ukraine war, and you end up with these silly narratives that they want to restore the Soviet Union or march on Berlin and all these things, which makes absolutely no sense at all.
well, the bigger the lie, the more credible it is if you repeat it often enough. That's the old saying, isn't it? So, Professor Diesen, do you have any perspectives on Europe? It's looking pretty bleak right now, and where to go from here? I mean, maybe we just have to accept what's happening, but what's your take on it?
Well, I said the same thing for the past 30 years, almost, or at least 20, since the Rose Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. It's that the problem we did in the early 90s by expanding NATO, because I would encourage everyone to remember that we actually had agreements for a pan-European security architecture based on
Yes,
indivisible security without dividing lines. This was the Charter of Paris for New Europe. This was in 1990. This was the foundation of the OSCE in 1994. What
yes.
we did was we wanted to make sure that America was anchored in Europe. So we instead went for NATO expansion. This killed off the inclusive European security architecture. So we made an enemy out of Russia. We knew it would make an enemy out of Russia, but we did it anyways. This was the price we paid to have America in Europe. And I understand this. Americans are pacifier. They make us more relevant. There can be an ideal leader to some extent, but that's the choice we had. But now Europe is divided, and we're in a multipolar system, which means the Americans will set their eyes on other regions of the world. They want to go to Asia. They want to go to the Western Hemisphere. They don't want to be in Europe anymore. They make this abundantly clear. This is in the national security strategy. So what do? Now we have divided Europe. We make an enemy out of Russia. We become then excessively dependent on an America which doesn't even want to be in Europe anymore. We should rethink. The world has changed since 1990, and we have to adjust, which means end this dividing lines in Europe. We don't have to ask Russia to join EU, but we have to have an inclusive security architecture where you actually discuss security concerns with your opponents as well, to reduce the security competition. If we can do this, if Europe's no longer divided, we can have more technological cooperation across Europe, and the more Europe which isn't divided, the Russians would be less dependent on China, the EU would be less dependent on the US. We would have a better economic prosperity, would have better security, and we wouldn't be taken advantage of by putting ourselves in this vulnerable frontline state position. So I think that's the main thing we have to do. We have to admit that some of the things we've done since the 90s were not just a mistake then, but they're based on a world which no longer exists.
Professor Diesen, thank you very much for this very interesting interview, and I hope we'll talk again.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I have my own channel if anyone wants to follow it, both one in German and one in English. So thank you.
Oh, really? In German too?
It's translated. My German is
We'll
terrible, but it's
we'll put a link. We'll put a
yeah,
link down
it's
so
Glenn
for
Diesen
people to
Deutsch.
follow. Okay,
Yeah.
we put the link down. So thank you again.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it.